Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to our weekly Kaffeepause. We're joined today by Soraya Sarhaddi Nelson. She's the host of the podcast Common Ground and is based in Berlin. Prior to this, she served as special correspondent for NPR, and she was NPR's bureau chief in Berlin from 2012 to 2018. What's particularly interesting about Soraya's background is that she did some extensive reporting from Ukraine in her career, and I want to come back to that later in the conversation and get her take on what's going on the ground. Soraya, it is great to see you again. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the last time we spoke, Soraya, was in October, and it is incredible because a lot has changed since then. I'd even go so far as to say that the world has changed in the past week, and that Germany's foreign policy posture has changed significantly over the last weekend. So there's a lot to talk about. Let me just set the stage briefly. On Saturday, the German government announced that it would provide weapons to Ukraine. And yesterday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke at a special session of the Bundestag. In a major policy shift, he committed to delivering weapons to Ukraine, increasing Germany's defense spending, and also reducing Germany's dependence on Russian oil and gas. So let's talk a little bit about this so-called new blueprint for German foreign policy and the reactions to it. You, of course, Soraya, live in Germany. You've lived in Germany for a long time. You've been a long-time observer of German politics. Were you surprised by this speech?
For sure. I mean, it's been a few days of where my jaw is sort of hanging open with developments in Germany and the European Union. But I thought it was in 29 minutes, more than a half century of German history changed, or German policy changed. And it'll be very interesting to see whether this coalition government can follow through. It's just, when you think about the fact that Angela Merkel, who was the most conservative party that was arguably the most pro-defense, in charge for 16 years, and there wasn't this kind of development that we saw from this traffic light coalition, which is one would perhaps think might be a little more peace-oriented, more green-oriented, considering the Greens. So it was definitely very eye-opening, shall we say.
So let's talk a little bit about the reaction, right? In the Bundestag, there was a lot of applause, but there was also some booing. I'd love to hear your sense of the response and also the public reaction. I mean, I was interested to see that the Bild Zeitung said Super Scholz. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung commented that Olaf Scholz has finally heard the shot that went around the world, if you will. So there's been some praise from the media, but can you talk a little bit about how you perceive the German response to be to this?
Well, if we take it from the Bundestag, I mean, there was a standing ovation that went on for quite some time to Olaf Scholz giving credit and acknowledging Russians who stood up in Russia to protest against the war. But by the time it came around to NATO, and we need to do better to meet commitment, and we're in fact going to spend more than 2% of our GDP, which, I mean, again, is something that for, I think, the better part of a decade, American presidents, NATO has been trying to pressure Germany to do, and suddenly Putin was able to get them to do it. You had sort of lukewarm applause. And then by the time it got around to increasing military spending and actually improving or increasing the German military capability, there were actually boos in the audience. It wasn't really clear. I was watching it on public broadcaster Phoenix, so they didn't really pan to the audience. I couldn't really see who was booing, but there certainly wasn't a whole lot of applause. And so this is a really uncomfortable change for Germans, or certainly for German leadership. And while newspapers with blaring headlines, and certainly the ones you mentioned, I think are more hawkish, shall we say, than perhaps some others. I was out yesterday in Berlin when there were 500,000 people That was the highest estimate, but it was definitely many, I would say several hundred of thousands in Germany protesting against war, against weaponry, against that sort of thing for Ukraine, but in a very muted way. In fact, the Ukrainians ended up having their own protest because they objected to this sort of peace-nick kind of approach to the protest that's going on. So I think Olaf Scholz is going to really have a selling job. The Germans are they're not comfortable with this. Yes, it's some people poo-poo. I know in Politico, for example, it was poo-pooed that this mythology, as it was called, of German discomfort since World War II with fighting, but it is really in the German psyche here. They don't like the idea of being sort of an aggressive military force because of the history. So this is really tough, but at the same time, they support their Germans who are in uniform, and the military here has been quite an embarrassment. So I think there will be some welcoming of actually upgrading equipment, working within the EU also with the French to improve, to get better tanks and that sort of thing. There wasn't as much applause, shall we say, for buying F-35s, buying equipment from the Americans or Israel. They talked about drones from Israel, for example, did not go over well. But it's something that has to happen. And I think maybe this is the turning point that Scholz, maybe Scholz is onto something. But I think it's going to be an uphill battle. I mean, he's facing a lot of 60% of Germans in the recent poll did not approve of the way he's being chancellor. And 66% in a more recent poll this past few days were not opposed to the German policy of not sending weaponry to Ukraine. So I think it's an uphill battle for him, for sure.
But I guess, your point is very well taken, that it will be an uphill battle to sort of make the case. And your point of this is going to be a hard sales job that he's got ahead to make the case to the German public that this is important at this time. And yet, I would think partly because of the hot war that's going on Europe's doorstep, that many Germans might recognize that this is a new reality and one that requires a new response. And it sort of reminds me of another time when there was a government that was led by the Social Democrats with the Greens, namely the government of Schröder and Fischer, that did take decisive action in the Balkans. And that was something that was also not anticipated at that time of that government. So there are some parallels between that government and now this government, also with the Free Democrats, really trying to move the needle and move forward.
Except we have to think about Schröder's relationship with Russia since then. And
yes.
he's become much, Germany's, I think, not as uncomfortably partners with Russia as it would like to act, on it is. I mean, it likes to make money, and it saw a good partnership there with its technology, its engineering, its products, and merging that with the wealth of the oligarchs, the wealth, of Putin himself. And again, this sort of history with Russia where it's like, we want to try to fix this. So I think he's got a hard task, because you're right. I mean, with the Balkans, it was something different. And it is always interesting how these coalitions that one doesn't imagine being actually the ones to make military breakthroughs ends up doing that. But I think there is some history, or more recent history here, even within the SPD, that makes this a difficult challenge. Plus, Schröder is more charismatic than Olaf Scholz. Olaf Scholz, let's think about it. He has been cast aside in this. When we were talking about talks with Putin, it was Macron talking to Putin. It was, other people. It's like nobody was really asking the Germans' opinion. Would we have had that if Merkel, for example, was still in charge? She was sort of leader at that point. And so it's interesting. He's just not that leader that I think Germans might respond to better when they're having to sort of re-identify their whole policy and their whole identity, for that matter.
That leads to another question that I wanted to ask you. Granted, this is a little bit more conjecture, but do you think that this kind of move that we heard from Olaf Scholz over the weekend would have been possible under a CDU-led government? And the reason why I'm asking that is that with the Social Democrats and the Greens in the opposition, I think it would have been an incredible uphill battle for a CDU-led government in order to introduce a policy like this.
Well, certainly if it was a minority government, which of course that was the
Right.
whole debate about why there was a grand coalition in the end last time. So I think it would have been harder, but I also think it would have been something that people would have accepted more, partly because Merkel, again, was the mother of the nation who had been there forever and was trusted what she said, even though she can be blamed partly, for why Germany is so dependent on them now. So yeah, I think it would have been an uphill battle, but I just think credibility fact is the question. Can Olaf Scholz project that credibility or achieve that credibility that he needs at a time where his numbers aren't so great? I mean, we'll see what the polls show in the coming days. I think we'll see more what the impact of that very historic speech will be.
Mm-hmm. So, Soraya, let's widen the focus a little bit and include Germany, but look at Europe a little bit more broadly, because the other piece of news that I was following from yesterday was the meeting of the EU foreign ministers last night, where there was a tremendous show of unity in developing a response to the invasion and really trying to develop a coordinated strategy within the European Union. There was agreement over a sanctions package. There was agreement over banning Russian planes from flying over EU territories and landing at EU airports. There was agreement on banning some institutions from the SWIFT payment system. But surprisingly, there have also been some calls for the EU to be a little bit more relaxed, or some would say ambitious, when it comes to accession talks for Ukraine. So there's a lot that the EU is talking about, and it is really showing tremendous unity. Can you talk a little bit about how you view sort of the collective European response?
That was part of why my jaw was hanging open this weekend. Was actually, I mean, I just in one little vignette here, Viktor Orban in his little jacket, showing up at a press conference, speaking English and saying, "This is the time for European unity and not time for cleverness, and we need to be unified and, to Russia." I mean, I don't know about you, but I was like, have I stepped through the looking glass? Where are we here? It's like Putin has managed to accomplish what the EU has just been unable to do for the entire time that I covered it. And that is achieve unity, actually make decisions, say, we're going to do this. We have a threat here and we need to do this. And not only that, but take a step in in terms of defense, like saying, okay, we're going to finance 50 million euros. I mean, well, they're not going to personally go and outfit Ukraine with weapons, but they're basically giving their members the green light to do that, and then we'll reimburse them for it. Who would have thought that? If somebody had asked me this 6 months ago, I mean, look at Crimea. Nobody could come to an agreement about anything in the end when Russia did that, or when Putin did that, I should say. This is, after all, as it's being described, Putin's war, at least here on this cut. And it's just shocking with what clarity. I mean, it almost makes you believe that the experiment that is the EU, which so many people question, that this really works, and that people were able to come together with this package. And I think that helped bolster, I mean, that will also bolster Germany's position, and I think, with in terms of public acceptance of what's happening, I think it was a really amazing thing. I still think, even with refugees, that's a big question too. I mean, we haven't talked about that because I know we're focused on the weapon and the war, but the refugees coming, I mean, more than 500,000 are said to have crossed already. And they are not, as much as Poland and Hungary and the neighboring countries are being open to Ukrainians flooding in, at some point they do have to be parceled out. And this at a time when countries within the EU, some of them, like France, Germany, Greece, Italy, they're already overburdened, overwhelmed with, or feeling overburdened and overwhelmed by refugees. So at some point, maybe that welcome won't be there. But it's just amazing, again, with the speed with which things are, I mean, this unification is happening. And I think it really is because the countries, the members, are worried about what's going to happen. They're worried that, if Putin is successful in Ukraine, I said once at the beginning, because I think ultimately, it's a hard, I think that most people would agree with me, or most, experts or journalists or whatever, that it just seems really unlikely that Putin, the man he is, that he's going back down on this adventure, and that in the end he's going to take Ukraine. And so then the question becomes: does he try to piddle away at the Baltics or Moldova or other countries, to grow this Russian empire? So I think the EU leader, I think this quick decision making and actually decisive and actually doing something that really makes a difference really has to do with this great fear that exists here right now.
And I guess what else do you think we can expect from Europe in terms of a response to the current crisis?
I think we have to see the repercussions of the SWIFT decision, even though it wasn't total removal of Russia from SWIFT. It was pretty significant. The air ban was pretty significant, but there still are holes there. You have the Russian fuel, and there's discussion about whether, Germany and other countries depend on that fuel. And I know that there's talk about going to Norway or going elsewhere, but Norway, frankly, is tapped out to a large extent. Can they really make up for a deficit? And can Russia really, the feeling is Russia is not going to provide the supplies needed. This is already why prices are going up, but at the same time, they're going to need the money as well. So there's still some loopholes there that I don't see going away completely, because the countries, like what would happen if suddenly we can't heat our homes here in what has been a pretty cold February and promises to be a cold March? I think people will start to get tired, and there may be some backlash. So I think at this point, I have a hard time believing they would actually go the extra step. And in this case, it wouldn't be necessarily EU, it would be NATO related, to actually start sending troops in. I think that, there's also fear, obviously, of the nuclear scenario that Putin has threatened, whether it's an empty threat or not. I don't think any of us want to test. So I think those are factors that may put the brakes on further actions at this stage.
And that's actually a perfect segue to one of our viewer questions, who's curious about what the reaction has been to Putin's nuclear threats, and the fact that Russia has stepped up the level of alert of its nuclear weapons.
I think it's a generational thing. It's interesting. Even now, in my case, I have an American household living in Germany for a long time, but my son, who's 32, he was born in '89. He doesn't remember the Cold War the way my husband and I do. So we take it in stride a little bit more, like, okay, he's just, rattling the saber, if you will. Even he must understand what the consequences are of, shooting off a nuclear missile. And let me just say this: the callousness with which attacks are happening in Ukraine that have released some radiation are causing some concern. But I do think that, there is some, even though people are worried, I think it's the younger generation is more worried. And it's, I guess the older generation is sort of taking a wait and see, or saying, good, the sanctions are working. He's obviously not happy, but he's really going to push that in. But then again, who knows with this man? I've tried, honestly, from 2014, I thought I understood what he was going to, considering I'd covered Ukraine since then, I thought I knew what he was going to do with Ukraine come this week. I have to admit, I'm a little surprised, a lot surprised. I was shocked is a better word, that he did what he did. So who knows? So there is that discomfort that exists here, and certainly by the number of people who turned out yesterday at a march that was supposed to be for 20,000, and more, like if the 500,000 number is true, that these are again, the estimates range from several 100,000 to 500,000. That's a lot of people turning out, and I think it has to do with that fear. It has to do with the concerns. But in terms of the official reaction, I think Stoltenberg has been the most, I would say, the most, not alarmist, but the most concerning. I think everyone else has tried to tamp it down a bit. Anyway.
So you said that you were shocked by what he did, what Putin did, and that he's taken it this far. I think you're not alone in that. And for months now, or at least for weeks now, people have been really trying to read Putin's mind and figure out what he wants and what his end game is. Do you have any sense of what that might be? Do you think it will stop with Ukraine? Do you think he will start nibbling at the Baltic states, for example? Obviously, over the past few months and even years, there have been cyber attacks, there have been murders in this heart of Berlin, in the UK. There have been a number of incidents where Putin has basically sought to keep the West off kilter and off balance. And I think in many ways it was kind of a lead up to this moment and to this invasion. But the question is really sort of how far does he go?
I think he's finding it a lot harder to take Ukraine, let alone keep Ukraine once it happens. I mean, yes, he has the military superiority. He's shown the willingness to actually go in and attack Ukraine. There is a much more of a reluctance on the part of NATO to try and engage on a military level. I mean, there's some question here. I think people do ask, is NATO really going to step in or if Estonia goes, or if they invade Estonia? So I think there's a huge fear and a huge question of that. But I think also, I mean, it used to be that Putin was a little bit more pragmatic. And I mean, I can just name one country, Afghanistan, that was the graveyard of empires, that was really difficult for the then Soviet Union. And so do you want Ukraine to become that sort of pot, festering pot for your country that you're trying to stay president of for the rest of your life? And basically your followers end up being in charge. And so I think he's felt his, feeling a little singed, if you will, at the moment. I don't know. I'm not convinced that this is enough that he's going to say, okay, I tried this, it didn't work. But I think he may, depending on how this goes in the next few weeks, if it continues to be really difficult and the country is really suffering, I think he's going to have to rethink his strategy to build a Russian empire. I think, though, as you mentioned, the cyber attacks, the assassinations in Western countries, those pretty much went without a hitch. He's been able to put his opposition in jail. And while the economy has really festered under sanctions that have been imposed since 2014, he's been doing okay. So maybe he goes back to that. I mean, it's hard to know in this guy's brain because honestly, I'm still trying to understand what the end game is here with Ukraine, what he thought he was going to accomplish. Did he really think that? Do we seem so weak in the West that he thought he could get away with this? And then what? So I mean, if he feels that he's gotten away with it, then yeah, I think we are talking about a continued military. But I think the alternative is not very pleasant either. I mean, the idea of cyber attacks or destabilizing countries from the inside, the way he did Ukraine, that's not a good thing. I mean, that's still going to destabilize the world order as we know it.
On the periphery of the Munich Security Conference last week, I had the opportunity to talk to a Ukrainian exile who now works as a journalist for Deutsche Welle in Bonn, and he was talking about how naive he thinks the West has been in responding to Putin up to now, and that each of these incidents, the ones that you talked about, that I talked about, have basically been treated as isolated incidents and sort of not seen as a whole and not seen as a process. And he said, we really need to be following Putin much more closely because this is all part of a bigger plan. You, of course, have covered Ukraine extensively. You reported from there for over 3 years. What's sort of your take on how countries like Ukraine were watching what Putin was doing to the West? Do you think that there was a less naive response than we've sort of seen in many Western capitals?
Less naive response by Ukraine, you mean, or by?
Yes, by Ukraine, that the Ukrainians were sort of more tapped into, this is a pattern, this is something to watch, this is building up to something else. I mean, of course, since 2000, I mean, one of the things that I've found sitting here in the US is that it's very often important to remind people that what we're experiencing now is sort of a new chapter in an ongoing conflict rather than a new conflict, and that Ukraine and Russia have been at war since 2014, that there have been casualties throughout that time, And so, Ukraine has been in the thick of things for much longer than just the military buildup since earlier in the year.
Well, I think Ukraine was a perfect example of how the West is like welcoming when somebody steps out of the former Soviet or current Russian orbit. And obviously, Yanukovych is, being driven from power and having this revolution that was sort of an Arab Spring, but, Ukraine style, that actually succeeded, was welcomed by us. But then there was not enough follow-up. I mean, the problem is that Ukraine is a country, like many in that region, that is plagued by, corruption, and oligarchs reign supreme there. I did a pretty, what I thought was my favorite story that I did from Ukraine about the oligarchs and how they were in charge and how openly they were in charge. And so the West is like, okay, we welcome you. And it's a slap at Moscow, and nobody can say anything about that. But we're not going to let you into NATO because we have questions about, your ability to be part of NATO and what the repercussions of that are. And even within the EU, we have limitations. We're going to open certain things, but we really follow through. And I think we just sort of turned a blind eye to the reality that is Ukraine. I mean, if you go to the western part of the country, or even Kyiv, the capital, you have a whole different perspective of what's going on in Ukraine than if you're in the east, where I spent a lot of time covering the Donbas region. And I even went into these quote unquote independent republics that that Russia has been setting up as Russia, and then Crimea, which just was annexed. And again, the West, what did the West really do about that? So this, we were sort of setting the stage for Putin to say, I think I can get away with this, A, and B, we weren't really taking into account, okay, Ukraine, we weren't helping Ukraine sort of overcome its issues and holding its feet to the fire. And again, the EU hasn't been able to hold its own members to the fire, whether it's Hungary or Poland or other countries that are developing it or were developing into autocracies and still are. So I think that that is the naivete that I think that comes out of the West. The fact that we immediately, that we let the Baltics into NATO, and that we, various other former members of the Soviet satellite structure. I mean, it's understandable from our perspective. It makes sense from a geopolitical standpoint and strategic standpoint for NATO and the United States. We were poking Russia, and we weren't really doing anything about sort of smoothing things over or finding ways to sort of reach kind of equilibrium. I think that's the failing of the West. I do think Ukraine, even if it's amazing to see the people going out, and it is a surprise to me a little bit that Putin is so surprised that there's such resistance to Russia coming in, because I think he's starting to believe his own hype. But I do hope that we learn a lesson from this, or several lessons from this that allow us to not just expand, willy-nilly where we feel it's strategically important and something that we need to do, but also that we actually think about the repercussions and try to smooth things over. I mean, now I think we have a situation where there's going to be a new world order. We're going back to the Cold War stance. I don't know how we get out of that, even if Putin goes back to Russia and doesn't take Ukraine in the end, which I don't think. Again, I'm still, I don't even know how to phrase it, but I'm still pretty much sure that he's going to get what he wants out of Ukraine, and it's going to be a very bad thing for Europe and for the world.
I mean, in light of that, do you think that there is any likelihood that Ukraine will be admitted to the EU? This whole discussion about sort of fast tracking Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine's got problems of its own, right? The corruption is huge. The oligarchs play a significant role. Part of the reason why Ukraine has not been viewed as a potential EU member state seriously is because of some of its domestic problems, not to mention that it doesn't have its sort of regional integrity, if you will. And, given the current threats, and that you think that Putin might wring it out and take everything that he wants, it seems to me that this is sort of unlikely, and I'm kind of surprised at the calls for a declaration by Brussels that Ukraine would be, admitted to the process for membership to the EU?
I have a really hard time seeing it, despite the calls that you're speaking about. But then again, my jaw's been hanging open much of the weekend, so I never want to say never.
Right.
I don't see that happening. I mean, the struggle to get into the EU is along the lines of the struggle we see with NATO, get to NATO. I mean, it's not easy. There are a lot of members, everyone has a say. And frankly, I think Brussels is already a little reluctant about its Eastern membership because of the great divide that was happening, and that I think we still could go back to once this immediate crisis, this immediate war is forgotten or is over, or whatever the case might be. And we have to remember, if Kiev falls, I mean, if a new leadership goes in and Ukraine goes silent, or at least the people that we consider to be, it's just going to be this uncomfortable relationship again, like I have with so many Soviet Russian satellites or satellites, so I don't think something like that can be fast tracked in the best case scenario, and this is more of a worst case scenario right now. So I don't see it happening.
So given your extensive reporting from Ukraine, both in the eastern part of the country, but also the West, one of our viewers is curious why there hasn't been more reporting on the economic deterioration in areas of the Ukraine that Russia has taken over since 2014. That this is something that should be communicated more broadly to give people a better understanding of what sort of what's going on in the Russian separatist regions.
I think it's really difficult. I mean, I can't speak to Crimea because I have not gotten in there, but Russia controls who gets into these areas, correct? So in my case, I was very lucky. In 2017, that was the last time I went into the Donetsk People's Republic, as it's called. And I was the only Western journalist who got in. I mean, there was actually one photographer who was there. And then there was a Ukrainian Russian woman who was also there. And I think she was writing for a Texas monthly magazine or something like that. It was not like a big major player, but you can't get in as a reporter. And these are very clear areas that have, borders and that have soldiers and whatever. You can't get in. You can't like sneak in, if you will. It's impossible. So I think the lack of information is because of that, and also what information is getting out of there is very much Russian, propaganda driven. The kind of stuff that you will see being broadcast to the Russians, who most of them apparently don't really know that there is a war going on in Ukraine right now. They think there's like a minor skirmish. Now that may change, obviously, with the sanctions and the runs on banks, and obviously, the fact the stock market closed. At some point, Putin has to explain all this to the people. They're not, going to stay silent forever about it. But it's also important to remember that, when I was in Donetsk and I actually were able to get around and talk to some people, they were quite relieved to be part of Russia. They're Russian speaking. They are ethnically Russian. They don't see Russia as a bad thing. They see Russia, or at least they didn't. I don't know what's going on, obviously, right this minute with the wars in Kharkiv and stuff. They were actually happy to be becoming part of the Russian pension system, to be able to use rubles rather than Ukrainian currency, and they were happy to fly Russian flags and be able to get back and forth into Russia to do their shopping. It was a welcome relief almost to them, because they felt so neglected by Kyiv. Because again, in the western part of the country, it's a whole different dynamic. Russian is not the official language, for the country. Ukrainian is, and so the Russian minority felt neglected. I saw the same thing with the Russian populations in Estonia when I was there covering it. And these are the people that Putin is using as an excuse to do his, expansion, his empire expansion that he's doing right now. And they can't be ignored. You cannot ignore that aspect of it, because it does give him some legitimacy in his, at least at home, to be able to do what he's doing. And so I think that's part of why we don't hear about it. In terms of what the actual economic picture is, I can't, again, speak to it, because you can't get into these areas very easily. But I do know from the people that I've talked to that they were actually quite happy about being linked to Russia. And again, whether that's changed because there's a war going on and their homes are being blasted, to smithereens and everything, I can't, speak to. I mean, I think there is much more unity in Ukraine, just like there's unity in the EU and there's unity in Germany, and everything is changing. Yeah. I think Putin has inadvertently changed that dynamic in Ukraine as well.
So in terms of changing dynamics, I have two viewer questions I'd like to fold in. One of our viewers is curious what you make of the banning of Russia Today and Sputnik in the EU, because this basically provided Putin with the ability to ban Radio Free Europe and Deutsche Welle from working in Russia. Should we have calculated the greater risk of depriving the Russian people from alternative views and information?
Well, I think it's sort of, again, something that they can hold up, that when I say they, the EU can hold up and say, look what we did, we've done these things. I never like shutting down voices, even disparate ones, although it's pretty clear that RT and all these entities are very much Russian organs of the government rather than actually free media. So, I mean, I do know that Radio Free Europe had quite a range during Soviet times. I don't know how much it does nowadays. Certainly, I know places like Afghanistan, those sorts of organs or those sorts of media did have more reach. But yeah, to me, it's just, I don't think that is, if that's what the EU wanted to show as look what we're doing to Russia, I think it was not the greatest example. And yes, I do, I understand the Russian response to that. It's unfortunate, but I don't think that Russian people are necessarily getting any of that input, that it's changing their minds. Again, I think the majority don't know that there's a major war going on in Ukraine. So.
And thank you for that. Another of our viewers just wrote in that they are hearing news that Iran is supporting Russia. Is this something that you've heard? And if so, is that something that you can elaborate on for us?
Well, certainly because of all the sanctions to Iran from the West, and which increased under Trump, and they haven't really gone back. And obviously a new nuclear deal has not been negotiated yet. And so Iran has for a long time been into Russia. Putin obviously has helped fill the void where the West has been out. So I don't think Iran feels it has much of a choice, frankly. And certainly the people don't necessarily feel that way, because I've seen a lot of videos and certainly some coverage by my New York Times colleague and friend, Farnaz Fasihi, that the people are actually siding with Ukraine. Or at least the ones who are feeling emboldened to speak out. But yeah, I mean, the government, I would have been surprised if they hadn't supported Russia, frankly, because I don't think that they really have a choice. I mean, if they alienate Putin, then that leaves China to some extent. And it's Iran is, I mean, the regime there is in deep trouble anyway with the population.
Yeah. And then the final question that sort of comes back to current news and what we might expect. The Russians and Ukrainians are meeting in Belarus for some talks, and the big question, I think, in a lot of people's minds is what can we expect to come out of those talks? In one of the reports that I heard this morning on Deutschlandfunk, the expectation was we can't really anticipate much to come out of it because the people who will be attending those negotiations are fairly low level. And yet, I think that there's a certain amount of hope, and certainly on the side of Ukraine, the desire to show that Kiev is open to negotiating. But what are your thoughts on what we might expect to come out of those talks, if anything?
Well, if the military situation is as the intelligence on the West, in the Western capitals has described, I don't think we're going to see anything come out of it, because I don't see Kiev capitulating to, basically having the government replaced. If in fact they do reach some kind of agreement, or they allow Russia to hold territory that it's gained, including the water source, down near Crimea, which is pretty key, not just for Crimea, but for Ukraine as well, I think that is going to show that the military situation was more dire than we've been led to believe. But I mean, I sort of agree with what the forecast has been, that there isn't likely to be much coming out of this. As you noted, these are lower level officials. I mean, I couldn't have imagined the Ukrainian president actually going to Belarus. I mean, we know what happened with the Belarus. I mean, I think of that journalist whose plane was, brought down in Minsk long ago. I wouldn't trust the situation there, and I'm sure that the Ukrainian leadership doesn't either. Yeah.
And that was initially the position of Ukrainian leadership to not enter talks in Belarus with Russia. And so I was sort of surprised to wake up today to hear that talks will be taking place, even if it's not at the highest level.
But I think you pointed out correctly that it's the show. I mean, to show that both sides are willing, you have to have, and who knows, maybe come to it on something little. But I mean, again, if there's any capitulation on the side of Ukraine, I think it suggests that the end is closer than we think.
Well, it's not an optimistic note to end on.
Sorry.
But in these difficult times, it's hard to find an optimistic note. I guess the one element of optimism from our conversation today is sort of that European unity and certainly the transatlantic unity that's on display in face of this incredible challenge. And we're all trying to read Vladimir Putin's mind and figure out what he wants, because as you said earlier in our conversation, that this really can be described as Putin's war and not Russia's war. It's a whole other topic of discussion to think about how people in Russia are feeling about this. I've heard a number of different viewpoints and opinions, but they've also included that many Russians are not supportive of this military action in Ukraine. And so we, certainly just have to see how this plays out. We're only in day 5 of this hot conflict, and undoubtedly a lot more will come in the days and weeks ahead. But Soraya, I want to thank you again for making the time on a very busy news day to sit down and talk with me about what's going on in Germany and what's going on in Ukraine. And we look forward to hearing your analysis again in the future. And let me also put in a plug for your podcast again. For those viewers that are not familiar with Common Ground, I can highly recommend it. You can find it in your podcast store or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. But Soraya and her colleagues always come up with interesting topics and interesting speakers for those podcasts. So
yeah,
thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Actually, the one that's dropping today is about the economic impact of Ukraine, of what's happening there, as well as the end of the pandemic and the end of, so just talking about some of the global economics. If I could just put that little plug in. And yeah, the best way to search for it is Common Ground Berlin, because lo and behold, Common Ground apparently is a very common phrase. So Common Ground Berlin is the best way to find it. And Steve, thank you so much for having me on, as always.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Take care and stay well.
Okay, you too. Take care. Bye.